You do not want to miss this episode. We're going to talk about Bitcoin, and we're going to start right at the beginning. What is Bitcoin? How to get started? Why you need to know about it if you want to secure your financial future. Hi, everyone. I'm Darren Mitchell. Welcome to Control and Compound. Joining me today, as always, is Christina Wyatt. Christina, how are you?
I'm doing great, Darren. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, Christina. Let's dig into this, but first, I want you to say your piece, and then I want to talk about a couple disclaimers.
Yep, of course. So just want to remind everybody that if you are listening on your favorite podcast platform, you're going to want to subscribe and leave that 5-star review. But if you're watching on YouTube or listening on YouTube, make sure you like, subscribe, and hit the bell button so you always know when new content is coming out. We also want to remind everybody that we've got that new Facebook community out there, Infinite Banking for Real Estate Investors. So if you haven't already joined, make sure you go there and join now. And then don't forget to follow us on our socials at Control and Compound on Instagram and TikTok. I got that all out of the way. Now we can talk Bitcoin, and I know you're excited to chat about this, and I'm excited to learn because I am that person that needs to learn about it. I don't know much about Bitcoin.
Yeah, and I think what we're going to do is we're going to do a series on Bitcoin in the next number of months, and I just want to preface this by saying I am not a Bitcoin expert. I do not ever suggest to any client, any person I meet that they should buy Bitcoin. Yes, I own Bitcoin myself, not cajillions of dollars, but I have so many clients invested in Bitcoin. I decided that I need to understand Bitcoin better. And so I've been learning about Bitcoin, attending Bitcoin conferences, training, online training. And I just wanted to kind of share what I've learned. And so, it's like, those books, Christina, like such and such for dummies or whatever. This is kind of a Bitcoin for dummies, and we joked earlier. Maybe we'll call it Bitcoin for dummies by dummies, because again, we're not professing to be experts on Bitcoin, but we're pretty good with money stuff, and so if you understand money and investing and savings, and then Bitcoin really starts to make a lot more sense. So. Again, we're not Bitcoin experts. We're not saying buy Bitcoin, but I encourage you to learn about it. If I was a young person, I say to my kids right now, if you want to be, if you want to know where you should be investing your time, money, and effort, I would learn about AI and I would learn about Bitcoin, right? And infinite banking, of course. But
Oh yes.
those would be the two things that I would want to learn about: Bitcoin and AI. I'm learning about Bitcoin and AI, and I'm not in my 20s, but I think that's really both those things could be huge, obviously over the next 10 to 20 years. So, you should learn about it now.
Yeah, absolutely. We talk about investing in yourself all the time, and one of your biggest investments is in education and learning these types of things. So I love that we're chatting about it. I'm definitely going to rely more so on you, though, Darren, because you've been going to these conferences, learning, and this is I love this because I get to ask you the questions, and we get to talk more about what you've already learned. I love learning from other people, and you go do it first, and then I can follow. So I think that we should really get started from the top, though. Like, what is Bitcoin?
Actually, I want to start even before what is Bitcoin. I really want to start is what is money, right? And I think you need to understand what money is before you can fully appreciate what Bitcoin is and why so many people are excited about Bitcoin and the future for Bitcoin. So when we think of money, all money is a store of value, right? Money equals value. That's it. Okay. Now the key is we all agree that it represents value. Okay. So if you think of the history of money, people used to trade, beaver pelts, it used to be wheat. It was these massive boulders in some cultures. And then eventually they kind of came around to gold as being a store of value. And everyone agreed, okay, gold has value. Therefore, if I, have a ounce of gold, that is value, and I can trade this value for your goods and services. So people started trading gold, and that was really the first fundamentally or universally accepted value or money because people accepted that gold had value. But one of the key factors of money is everyone has to trust that it has value and trust the source of it, right? So that was kind of how gold got started.
Gold got started. So yeah, so you talk a lot about gold, but what about where did the paper money that we're using now come into hand? Like where did that come into play?
Yeah, well, if you think of, you're in the, hundreds of years ago, you're walking around with your bar of gold, and you're like, I'd like to buy that goat. That would be a nice addition to the farm or whatever. And you want to buy a goat, and you're like, how much for the goat? And it's like 1/1000th of a bar of gold, and you're like, well, let me get my knife here and see if I can cut off a 1/1000th of this bar of gold. So right, so gold was very cumbersome, and so it was like, well, how do I divide it? And then people started, shaving the gold off, or then they had gold coins and they would shave the edges off to try to get more gold and stuff. So eventually they got to a point where people would go, well, I don't want to carry around my gold. So they had these basically gold depositories. And a gold depository would be, Christina's gold depository. And I would go into Christina, and she would have a nice, secure facility there. And I would say, hey, Christina, here's my gold. Can you hang on to it? And then Christina, let's say it was 1,000 ounces of gold, or 1,000 grams, whatever it was. Christina would give me 1,000. Let's say it was 1,000 grams, 1,001 gram certificates of gold. So that was really the first paper money, or the first currency, because now I would have this sort of paper certificate saying I own 1,000 grams of gold. All right. Well, then it was like, if I needed the gold, I just go back to Christina and say, hey, can I have a piece of my gold? Sure. But then eventually people were like, well, why am I going back to the gold depository when I go to buy that goat? Why don't I just say, here's a piece of paper saying I own 1/1000th of a bar of gold. You take that, and now you can go to the gold depository, when you want money, and you can cash it in. So what happened is people started trading the paper instead of actually trading the gold. But the key is, the paper was backed by gold, right? So everyone knew that piece of paper, at any point, you could walk into the gold depository and you could cash it in for the gold that it says on that piece of paper. And that really went on for years and years and years and years, where gold fundamentally backed currency. So, Canada before the US, but all governments eventually had gold-backed securities, until US was the big change, and Nixon in 71 said, basically, you have to give me all your gold. They basically took all the gold in and said, we're no longer backed by gold. So when the government came in and they said, we're no longer backed by gold, instead of being backed by gold, it was backed by trust in the government. All right. So the government basically said, this is worth this much because we say it is. So if you trust the government, then everyone could agree, okay, it's still a store of value. We all agree it's valuable. The government says it's valuable.
Yeah, so it was really people wanting to be more efficient, right? Instead of
Yeah.
having to run around and have their gold, and having it backed by gold makes a lot of sense to me. The gold backing, definitely at the beginning there, worked well. We know that that has since changed, and now we have our trust in the government, which I do think that's leading our way to the discussion on Bitcoin. But you talk about that, which is where we are now with the fiat money system, right? So why don't you explain the fiat money system and where we are on that trust in the government with our banking system, not quite like how it was when there was a goat, a bar of gold, and, everything was fairly simple at that time, right?
Yeah. So, like, fiat is really, if you want to get very specific, the fiat is Latin for by decree. Okay. So by decree, the government, by law, says this is worth money. They're like, this piece of paper is worth $1, $5, $10. So it's by decree. So that's kind of the term legal tender. That's where legal tender came from, because the government said this is by law, by decree, it's worth something, and then it became legal tender. So the government said, great, that's legal tender for fiat money.
Okay, so but what are the downfalls with fiat money? It's not quite the same as the standard gold backed
Yeah.
situation.
So with fiat money, there's all kinds of problems, but the two key problems of fiat money is, number one, it's centralized, right? And you hear this term a lot, centralized and then decentralized, we'll get to. but it's centralized, which basically means there's a central authority, government in almost every single case. The government controls it, right? So the government determines the value. The government determines everything about it, and it's not limited. So the government, now, Christina, I know this would never happen in North America, the federal governments that would just print extra money when they want it, just print it for programs, print it to give away for COVID, just print money. But it's centralized, but it's also not limited, right? So every time the government prints money, all it does is it devalues all the money out there, right? If you think of a real simple example, and there's $100 out there, right? And there's $100 out there, and a bottle of water. There's 10 of them, and they each cost $1. Well, if the government prints twice as much money, well, those bottles of water are going to be worth $2. So there's no other explanation for inflation other than the government prints extra money. Now we
Yeah.
can have another separate argument about that, about
Well,
Austrian
we did
economics or
actually.
Keynesian.
We have that podcast on inflation that we did dig into this completely on inflation and where it comes from, which ties in very well to the conversation that we're having now on the fiat money and the problems that come from it, right? So yeah, inflation's huge. Any other downsides though with the fiat?
Those are the big ones. So centralized government control, and number two, not limited. So again, it goes back to that trust. How do you trust the government not to print extra money? And depending upon your view of the current two North American leaders, some people don't trust that they're not going to just keep printing money. And when they print money, in Canada right now, $1 in $5 didn't exist, I think, 5 years ago. So that's how much extra money they're printing in the US. Same idea. They're just printing money, and all printing does is drive the value of your dollar down, which drives prices up.
All right, Darren. So we talked a lot about money and paper money and where that came from with the fiat money system. But one thing we need to haven't talked about, we need to mention is that who has paper money anymore? Like I know I do not have paper money. I have a lot like plastic in my wallet. I think I saw some money. I had a card for my nephew's graduation. I put some cash in there, but it is very, very unlikely that I'm going to have cash on hand. Everything is digital, right? So how does the digital world and the PayPals and the internet banking, all of those things, how does that play into the fiat money system and, what we're talking about here?
Yeah, great question. So, what basically evolved over time is instead of the paper money, it would be basically a digital file saying, great, I have $1,000, right? You get your bank balance and say, I have $1,000 or whatever piece of credit card, whatever it is, $1,000, right? Well, what's to stop me from taking that file saying I have $1,000 and photocopying it 100 times and saying, just handing it out like candy and, spending it multiple times? Well, this goes back to that word centralized, right? So the centralized currency controlled by the banks, the Federal Reserve in the US, Bank of Canada, and then the independent banks, is the banks basically keep ledgers, right? And the banks go, okay, Christina has $1,000 in her account, and Darren has $800 in his account, and they have ledgers, and we basically have to trust the banks and the federal bank as well, to keep track of all this digital money. And we say, great, this is how much digital money we have, and therefore we can't just copy the file and do a bunch of it. But it goes back to that word trust, that we trust the banks and the federal government to keep a ledger on all that money.
There's a lot of trust happening here. All the places I don't typically trust, but okay. We won't go down that just yet. But you talked a lot about you had an emphasis on centralized when you talk about it. So why is that word centralized so important in our conversation today?
Yeah, well, there's centralized money creates, again, a whole host of problems, but probably the top three in my non-expert opinion, right? I have an economics degree, but I'll be honest, I don't remember a lot of the classes. I remember Mr. Gillis in grade 12 being my best economics teacher I ever had, including my profs that I have an economics degree in. But the big three problems I think of centralized money, number one is control, right? We are basically giving up control of our money to the banks and the government, right? And some people are fine with that. Some people aren't fine with that. Some people are growingly concerned with that. But with centralized money, you give up control of your money, right? The government can seize it. The government can take it. The government can lock it down. You give up control. Number two, corruption, right? It leads itself to corruption. Now, I don't know if you remember the Wells Fargo fiasco, the Wells Fargo absolute gong show back 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years, whatever it was, in the States. Well, their employees were actually creating fake accounts, right? Just digital fake accounts saying, Christina opened up another bank account and she has $10,000 over here and 100. They were creating fake accounts to drive up the value of the Wells Fargo shares, that they had more assets on the books than they really did, right? So again, centralized can lead to lack of control, can lead to corruption, and then the big one, my opinion, the big one that we're challenged with today is mismanagement, right? The government has no limit on the amount of money they can print. So you look at how the printing presses are going now, and agree or disagree, that's a different topic. But the governments are effectively digitally printing money in the U.S. and Canada and many countries around the world. But you look at an extreme example, you look at Venezuela. So, I'm trying to get one, but when I was at the Bitcoin conference in Toronto, a guy came in and he had a brick of money, this massive brick of money, and it was Venezuelan, I don't know, $2, $3, $5 bills, whatever, and it was worth 3 cents. So the entire brick of money, like this big, massive stack of money, was worth 3 cents. Why? Because the Venezuelan government, to appease their citizens, just started, or for whatever reason, started printing extra money. And then that caused to inflation, so they printed more money. And that caused prices to go up a lot, so they had to print more money. And it just got out of control till basically, through total mismanagement, the Venezuelan dollar was completely worthless, right? Completely worthless. And there's a couple great stories from the Bitcoin conference about people that fled Venezuela with their Bitcoin and survived, but story for another day. But those are the three big things. You give up control, or with problems with centralized, you give up control, corruption, and mismanagement are probably the three biggest ones I see.
Which are pretty big deal. The control thing, for sure, definitely huge. So we talked a lot about, money. We started, I asked the question, what is Bitcoin? We kind of went back to what is money, and we started at the very beginning, but we do want to talk a little bit more about Bitcoin. I want to pull this all together. So what about Bitcoin, Darren? Like what is Bitcoin? Let's bring it back and kind of put the two together.
Sure. So what is Bitcoin? So in 2008, I think it was October 2008, online there was just this paper or white paper or document that arrived, and it said it was written by Satoshi Nakamoto, not to be confused, I might have pronounced that wrong, with the Nakatomi building from what is it, the Die Hard? I always get confused with the Die Hard movie.
Yes.
So Satoshi put out this white paper and said, here's the cure for basically fiat currency. And he came up with a decentralized currency called Bitcoin. Okay, so let's dig through some of those things. Like let's talk about control, corruption, mismanagement. Okay, decentralized versus centralized. We talked about some of the problems with centralized money, the control, the corruption, the mismanagement. Well, decentralized money, the goal was to eliminate those problems, right? So Bitcoin is transparent. So in other words, it's not the banks keeping their ledger, right? You can't go see the ledger of the banks, right? Hey, can I see how much money everyone has? No. We have to trust that the bank is keeping it. Well, with Bitcoin, it's all transparent. If you're in the Bitcoin world, like millions of people, millions of computers around the world have all the transactions as they happen live with Bitcoin. So even if somebody came in and attacked a computer with Bitcoin on it, well, it's on a million other computers in the world, and it's transparent. You can actually see every transaction in the blockchain. You can go and say, oh, this address gave money to this address. So everything is transparent. So it's not hidden. That trust factor is gone because we don't need to trust because it's all transparent. It's not centralized. So therefore it means it can't be hacked, but it's also they can't print more, right? Bitcoin has a $21 million Bitcoin cap. Well, it's never going to increase more than 21 million because there's no government that says, "Oh, let's print more Bitcoin to solve our problems." You can't do that because it's not centralized, it's decentralized, and the Bitcoin world would never agree to more than the 21 million Bitcoins. Bitcoin is digital, right? So that problem of gold, where I got to slice a 1/1000th off of it, right? Well, that's not an issue because it's digital, right? And if you hear like Satoshi is just like I think a percentage of Bitcoin, you can have a Bitcoin is purely divisible, right, by thousands, by a million, depending upon the value, depending upon how many slices it is. So government has no control, right? India, a number of years ago, came in and said, we're going to basically declare that the $500 and $1,000 bills are or whatever their currency is, are useless, right? There's no value in them. They just basically confiscated those bills. They came in and said trade them in for new ones, but they devalued the currency. You could never have a situation, in China, the social credit score now, where there's actual social credit score where it's like, okay, you can't use your own money to travel because you already traveled once or twice today, or you said something against the government or something we didn't like. So they will control your money on what you can do with it. Well, that's never going to happen with Bitcoin. We had the truckers episode in Canada where if you donated to the truckers, they actually seized your bank accounts, froze your mortgages, your line of credit, your credit card. People could not function that were caught up in that. And again, agree or disagree, but from a centralized currency is because it was centralized. If it was decentralized, right? Bitcoin was the only money that actually got through to the truckers. So if we kind of step back and we look at Bitcoin compared to bank, well, the control, there's no government control, no bank control. There's no middleman. So when you want to send Bitcoin to another country, there's no fees, there's no exchange rates, there's none of that. Remember even years ago, the currency, they just same as credit cards today, right? They screw you when you buy in a different currency. They tack on a fee, they tack on extra charges and that. Well, Bitcoin is free to everyone. So, it's in theory, an awesome place for an awesome currency. But my last kind of points here to kind of sum up is, do I think Bitcoin is going to be the future? I don't know. I think there's a really good chance it is, but I'm not an expert, and I'm not giving advice on the future of Bitcoin. But where I see really where what needs to happen for Bitcoin to really get to that next level is there's two key things. And again, this is just my 2 cents. I believe we need consumer acceptance, right? So consumers need to accept that Bitcoin has value, right? Because it have money. Money has to be, everyone has to agree it's value. And I think for that, Bitcoin has to be able to be used in an easier fashion. You can use it now to pay bills if you know how and send and receive. But I think technology is getting there with apps and stuff. So you can literally, put Bitcoin on your phone and buy your coffee, or hey, Christina, let me tip you some Bitcoin, or if I tip a waitress or whatever. Like people are starting to do that now. So if we have consumer acceptance, and the second big thing we need, I think, for Bitcoin to really get to the next level is institutional money, right? So there is some institutions that are getting into it. One of the cool ones in our industry, Mass Mutual, which is a mutual insurance company in the United States, I think it was December of 2020, they actually purchased $100 million of Bitcoin, right? And you got to remember, what do insurance companies do? They think 100 years out, right? Insurance companies aren't thinking what's going to happen next quarter, next year. They're thinking, okay, we get 100. We sell a life insurance policy to a young person. We could have 100-year, payout on this. We got to start planning really for the long term. So I really thought that might have kind of spread through the insurance industry. It hasn't yet. So it, again, institutional really hasn't bought in. But one of the really kind of big things in the Bitcoin world, in Canada, you can go buy an ETF for your Bitcoin, right? You can buy, like, basically track the value of Bitcoin. So you're not actually buying Bitcoin, you're buying the exchange, the ETF, the index fund. If you do that, sorry, that was never allowed in the States. But BlackRock And for those of you that don't know BlackRock and Vanguard control the world. Now, maybe that's a bit of an exaggeration, but between the two of them, those two companies control $309 trillion, something like that. They have $309 trillion under management. So if you want to know, money is power. Those companies decide who's on the board, what goes on in the business. They decide. So BlackRock, the one of the largest one of the two largest companies in the world that I think control the world in some respects in respect to money. They applied to the SEC in the United States for a Bitcoin ETF,
Oh.
and BlackRock has a 99% success rate when they apply for an ETF. Because a lot of times companies apply for an ETF and it doesn't get approved. So Bitcoin ETF, BlackRock has applied. There's been no decision yet in the United States whether they're going to allow that. But I think if BlackRock is successful, then you're going to start seeing considerable amount of money pour into that ETF. Now that ETF is they physically need to go buy those funds, right? And that they're going to use a company called Coinbase, and that's why Coinbase shares are up significantly in the last period of time, because it's like, okay, if BlackRock gets into Bitcoin through an ETF, then all those people that BlackRock services will say, oh, okay, so Bitcoin, that's the way I can get into Bitcoin without really buying Bitcoin. Bitcoin's real. Money starts flowing in, and that's that institutional as well as consumer acceptance. And if that really starts to take hold where Bitcoin is accepted, then I think you're going to look back at 2023 or wherever we are today and say, I wish I had learned about Bitcoin back then, because if the money starts flowing into Bitcoin and it becomes socially acceptable, institutionally acceptable, consumer acceptable, then I think there's a real chance that Bitcoin could be considered a store of value and could be considered a world currency. So don't know if that's going to happen, but those are the things that are, lining up that like it could really, that's what gets people excited about the future of Bitcoin is, okay, this is the solution for all the problems with fiat currency. And if it becomes acceptable and people believe it's a store of value, then it could really take off.
I think you're right on the education side too. All these things need to happen for it to take off. Absolutely. But I think the first step is people getting educated on it, because I know that myself and other people as well, like the first time you thought of Bitcoin, you might have thought of it as an investment, not in a currency, right? A fund. Like you think of it as like a Bitcoin fund, and you have those ETF, like you have those other things happening in the background. But really, if you get to the bottom of it, it is a replacement of that fiat system, and it's a currency. It's not a fund, it's a currency. But I think there might have been some confusion there when we saw it go up and down, like we've seen it in the markets over the last couple of years. I think a lot of people were looking at it as an investment fund and not as the currency to what it, and correct me if I'm wrong, but that's kind of what my thought process was around it. And that's how I was thinking of it, that it was like another fund that you have to get invested into, but that's not it at all. This is a whole, like there's a foundation here, and there is some thought here going back to fixing centralized problems, the fiat money problems we see. Like there's a whole base of knowledge that went into this. This is not just a fund that you can throw your money into and it can go up and it can go down. It's a solution, and it's something that I think people do need to take the time to learn a bit more about, and look into those problems. Like sometimes you don't see it until it's in your backyard. And I think for Canadians, maybe when they heard that trucker story of people having their accounts frozen and stuff, I hear those questions all the time now. Like, could that happen to me? And this is where you need to be spending some time investing in your knowledge to learn more about, I think, though, anyways,
Yeah.
right? Darren, does
No,
that kind of sound right?
yeah, I absolutely agree. But back to your point of, it's not really trading like a currency.
Yeah.
Like, as I when we went through COVID and the government started printing money, well, in theory, what should happen is, if the government prints way more money, it should devalue the money. Well, Bitcoin, they can't print anymore. So Bitcoin, in theory, should have skyrocketed when those governments started printing more money, but it did the opposite. So Bitcoin kind of followed the stock market. When the stock market crashed, it crashed. Now, again, So people have not totally bought in that it's an accepted store of value because it was actually following the stock market. So time will tell, will that change and will people start to accept it as a store of value? Because if the government prints twice as much money, Bitcoin should double it or even more, right? In theory, if it's a true store of value. So the way I like to explain I explained it to a couple family members is think of Bitcoin as digital gold, right? Gold, there's like a limited supply. Bitcoin, there's a limited supply. Gold, pain in the butt to try to trade and pay for things. Well, this is digital gold. Right? Now, again, assuming if everyone buys into its digital gold, well, great, Bitcoin works and it can be traded and it's a currency. If people don't buy in, it's going to have its challenges. But more and more things are happening around the world that, I think there's a real good chance that Bitcoin could be more widely accepted than it is today.
Yeah, no, I still have lots more questions, but I think I still have lots more questions, which is why I'm so excited that we're doing the series, because I don't think it's just me out there that has these questions, right? So I'm thankful that you're going out and learning about this so we can have these conversations. That was a lot in one. I got to digest that, and then we can move on. I can get another series of questions for you lined up for another chat, because I do think we could continue talking about this for a lot longer. There's a lot to know about it, and we've really just scratched the surface in what we talked about today.
Yes. So yeah, just last point to say to the listeners or people watching, just if this is something you're interested in learning more about, like if we're on the right track here, just send us a note. Like, is this informative? Just let us know if this is something you want to learn more. We're planning, like you said, a short series, not every week, just every few weeks. We'll sprinkle it in, and we encourage you to invest your own time and money and learn about this. We don't profess to be experts, but we're just trying to share some education. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Have a wonderful day. Thanks for listening to this podcast. If you're listening on YouTube, please like, subscribe, and hit that bell button. If you're listening on your favorite podcast platform, please leave us a 5-star review and subscribe. And if you want more information, check out our website, controllandcompound.com, and you can sign up for an education session with one of our wealth coaches.